It started with a knock on my own front door and somehow ended with a call to the cops. But not just any call. One made on me. I had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood after a long stretch working nights. It was supposed to be a peaceful change of pace. Clean streets, friendly faces, or so I thought. Within the first week, I met Karen, the president of the local HOA. Everything about her screamed in charge. From the way she looked me up and down to how she barely smiled when I introduced myself. Her husband was no different, but colder. There was something in his eyes. Distrust, maybe something worse. At first, I brushed it off. I'm used to dealing with tough personalities. Comes with the job. What they didn't know and didn't bother to ask is that I'm not just another neighbor. I'm the newly appointed police commander for the entire district, but I don't go around flashing that. I believe respect should come naturally. Fortunately, for some people, it only comes with a badge. Things got tense fast. Complaints started, piling up false reports about my car being parked too long. Noise that didn't exist, even questions about whether I really lived there. It was all so petty, until it wasn't. One afternoon, I got home to find an eviction notice, taped to my door, signed off by the HOA. No warning, no hearing, just gone. Then came the shouting. Karen and her husband standing on my porch, smug and confident, saying I didn't fit the community. And just like that, they called the cops. On me. They stood there waiting, certain they had one. But what they didn't know was who would be responding to that call, and what happened next left the whole neighborhood in shock. Because when the officers showed up, I was the one in charge. What happened after that? Let's just say karma showed up in uniform. But trust me, this story is far from over. The officers who pulled up that afternoon were part of my own team, good people who knew me well. But they didn't let that get in the way of doing their jobs. They followed protocol, approached calmly, and asked for my side of the story. I could see Karen and her husband in the background, arms crossed, whispering to each other with smirks on their faces. They had no idea what was coming. While the officers spoke with me, Karen tried to insert herself into the conversation, interrupting with loud, dramatic claims about how I was suspicious and aggressive. Her husband chimed in too, tossing out buzzwords he thought would escalate the situation. I stayed calm, letting them dig their own hole. Because now, it wasn't just about me being a neighbor. This was starting to look like something deeper, like harassment, possibly even discrimination. But before any real action could be taken, I had to play it smart. I didn't tell the officers who I was just yet. I wanted everything documented, every statement recorded. If they were going to treat me like an outsider in my own home, I was going to make sure the truth followed the proper path. No shortcuts. No favors. The strange thing was, this wasn't just about HOA rules or neighborly disagreements. I started digging into the history of the HOA board, the neighborhood complaints, and even previous reports filed by Karen and her husband. What I found was a pattern: targeted complaints, usually against people who didn't quite match the usual mold of the community. Quiet evictions, petty violations that stacked up fast. It wasn't random, was intentional, and yet, somehow, they had always gotten away with it. I began to wonder how many others had been pushed out without anyone noticing. How long had they been using their position to control who got to live here? And why were they so confident they could do the same to me? Little did they know, they'd picked the wrong person this time. But I wasn't about to confront them, just yet, not until I had everything I needed, because sometimes the best way to win is to let them think they're winning first. Over the next few days, things got strangely quiet. No more fake complaints. No more surprise notices. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I wasn't wrong. Behind the scenes, Karen and her husband were doubling down. I started getting emails from the HOA about unauthorized landscaping, and a warning that my porch light didn't match the neighborhood standard. Petty stuff clearly meant to irritate me or force a reaction, but I didn't bite. Instead, I started talking to neighbors, quietly at first. Some were hesitant, others just nervous. But a few opened up. One older couple told me they'd been fined 3 times in 1 month for weeds that didn't exist. Another family said they were told their kids were being too loud while playing outside on a Saturday afternoon. Then came the story that stopped me cold. A woman, same background as me, who moved out last year after months of constant HOA pressure. She never filed a formal complaint, just packed up and left. That's when it hit. This wasn't just a problem, it was a pattern. A controlled environment where the board, led by Karen and her husband, used their power to quietly push out people who didn't fit their idea of community. And no one had stopped them because most people didn't know their rights, or were too afraid to fight back. Meanwhile, Karen was still trying to play the role of concerned neighbor. She'd wave at me in public, make little comments about how she hoped I was settling in, and even left a flyer about a neighborhood potluck on my doorstep. It was fake kindness, the kind meant to mask what was really going on. Her husband, though, didn't bother hiding it. The looks, the comments under his breath when I walked by, all added up, but I wasn't just watching them anymore. I was documenting everything, every email, every encounter, every neighbor's story. And while they thought I was just another frustrated homeowner trying to survive the HOA circus, I was quietly building a case. They thought they had control. But the real power shift hadn't even begun yet. By the 3rd week, the pressure was reaching a boiling point. More neighbors had started to quietly share their experiences. And a clear pattern was forming, one that pointed directly to Karen and her husband. They weren't just enforcing HOA rules. They were using them as weapons, selectively applying them to anyone they didn't like or trust. And while most people chose to stay silent to keep the peace, I couldn't. What really pushed things over? The edge was a surprise HOA inspection. I came home to find Karen, her husband, and 2 other board members walking around my property with clipboards, pointing at bushes and taking photos. No notice, no explanation. Just smug faces and fake concern. When I calmly asked what they were doing, Karen smiled and said it was routine. Though no other homes had been visited that day, the next morning I got a notice of violation citing overgrown plants, a loose fence post, and unapproved exterior decorations. It was laughable and clearly personal. But instead of reacting, I took it to the city inspector, who confirmed my property was fully compliant. I asked for it in writing. That same week, I filed a formal complaint with the city's HOA Oversight Board. Then I sat down with legal. Between the documented harassment, the neighbor testimonies, and the repeated attempts to push me out without due process, the case was stacking up fast. But I wasn't done yet. I requested a meeting with the entire HOA board, a public one. Karen tried to delay it, of course, claiming scheduling conflicts, but the city got involved and made it official. Word spread fast. By the time the night of the meeting arrived, neighbors were buzzing. Some were nervous, some were excited. Everyone could feel something was about to happen. I walked into that meeting with everything I needed: files, reports, witness statements. Karen and her husband sat at the front like it was just another boring monthly update. But when I stepped up to speak, the room went dead silent. They still didn't know who I really was, and they had no idea what was coming next. As I stood before the packed room, eyes on me from every corner, I took a slow breath and introduced myself not just as a neighbor, but as the district's police commander. The shift in the room was instant. Karen's fake smile froze. husband's face turned stiff. The same people who had called the cops on me were now realizing they'd invited one of the top law enforcement officials in the county into their neighborhood. Dan tried to run him out. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I calmly laid out the pattern of selective enforcement, the false complaints, and the intimidation tactics. I read from actual violation notices they'd sent to me and several other families' people who had never gotten a fair hearing. Never had a chance to respond, just pushed until they gave up. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Then came the twist no one expected. One of the newer board members, who had been mostly quiet until now, suddenly stood up and cleared her throat. "I have something to add," she said. Everyone turned. She pulled out her phone and began reading off emails real ones sent from Karen to other board members. In them were comments about keeping the neighborhood image clean, protecting property values from unfamiliar influences, and even directly referencing families by background. It was clear, coded, and disturbing. Karen tried to interrupt, saying the emails were taken out of context, but the damage was done. Whispers spread across the room. People who'd once dismissed the complaints as exaggerations were now seeing proof in black and white. And just like that, the story shifted. But this wasn't the climax. It was only the spark. The room was heating up, but I knew Karen and her husband wouldn't back down easily. That's not the kind of people they were. In fact, as I was packing up my folder, I caught her husband whisper